Queremos agradecer a la Secretaría de Cultura por el apoyo para realizar este festival, al British Council, por supuesto, y a la Inés Morelia, que nos ha apoyado también para realizar este festival. Recuerden, es muy importante para nosotros lo del reciclaje de equipos, entonces, y de equipos electrónicos. Recuerden que allí al fondo está unas cajas donde se pueden dejar algún material, y el viernes va a venir el supercamión a llevarse los super materiales que van a traer. Em, ¿Se me olvida algo, Rodrigo, de denunciar? No, no, muy bien. Entonces, comenzamos hoy con la conferencia de Tullis Rennie. ¿Rennie? ¿Es okay? Tullis Rennie, que se llama Listening to the Individual. Activism, Listening to the Individual. Así que bueno, comenzamos en tiempo. Así que bueno, muchas gracias.
Pero es para asegurar un poquito más de lo que digo. Antes de cambio por inglés, quería decir un gracias enorme a Rodrigo, a Francisco, a Tonali, a Dani, a todo el mundo aquí, el equipo de SEMAS, por la invitación y por todo lo que están haciendo. Sus esfuerzos son enormes y este festival es realmente algo especial. Y siento muy afortunado para tener la oportunidad de estar aquí tras del British Council también. Entonces, muchas gracias a todos ustedes. So I'm going to be presenting today with my colleagues from Spark. So my name is Tullis Rennie, and I and my colleagues are part of sound practice and research at City University of London. And so the talk is called Quiet Activism, and this is a second part, I guess, of some work which was initially presented on the concert on Monday night. The final piece on the Monday night concert was one that I was here presenting, but this is absolutely a collaborative work. So I'm really pleased to have some of the colleagues that I've collaborated with present here today on Zoom to help present this work that we're undertaking. The piece is called Quiet Activism. Listening to the Individual is the subtitle for this talk. And both the piece and the wider work that we're engaged in are looking to answer these questions which I've written here and which guided the making of the piece. So how do you think creative sound practice can attend to the climate crisis? And do you feel an onus on the individual in relation to climate action? So that's the generative departure point for much of this work, thinking through these difficult questions and looking to work within sound practice and art making to try and find some responses to those questions. I'll just say the background is of some relevance. This is where I live in Hastings on the south coast of England, south of London. It's not only to show that it can also be sunny in the UK, but it also is one of the sites of the conversations which were presented as part of the piece. And the reason, I guess, for this focus on the individual or listening to the individual stems from a personal concern or a personal difficulty with what I find to be perhaps a disconnect between the overwhelming sense of the climate crisis being dictated and also generated in some ways by international agreements, by large global megastructures, by multinational corporations, how that might then reconcile with the agency of the individual can sometimes feel something a little bit overwhelming to even begin contemplating. And so that's the position, the personal position that I've proffered in order to make this work. So I would say that this work is work as process. I would prefer that term rather than work in progress. Work in progress sounds a bit unfinished. And the piece was a finished piece that we presented on Monday night. Nevertheless, it's not the only iteration of the work, and it's a mutable, modular, and ongoing work, and it doesn't solely finish or become presented in the composed form. It takes various forms and may also take new forms in the future as it continues. This is quite new work. So the piece that was presented on Monday night is a semi-improvised performance in 3 layers. And those layers are conversations between 4 pairs of artists and discussing those questions which I just presented. There's also a layer of live improvised electronics and a further layer of live amplified voice, both of which came from me on Monday night. So I'd like to introduce some of my colleagues. Firstly, I should say that the sound practice and research at City Group is not exclusively the 4 of us you can see behind here. There are more colleagues involved. But these colleagues were present and working collaboratively in this particular piece. And so we have Joseph Browning, a colleague who unfortunately can't be with us today, and also Aaron Ironbond and Claudia Molitor, who I'm very glad can be with us today. So hello, Aaron. Hi, Claudia. Thank you for being here. So the initial departure point for this work was that the 4 of us here contacted 4 further artists and invited them to have a conversation around these questions. So immediately this authorship, if you like, or the way in which the work is being created was distributed amongst a wider pool of voices, of ideas, of participants. So the 4 people that we engaged in conversation around this topic were the singer Juliet Fraser, the performance artist and improviser Jan Hendrikse, the sound artist and sound practitioner Catherine Clover, and a instrumentalist and composer called Ruby Colley. I am wondering whether we've lost the Zoom connection momentarily, and I was just about to hand over to my colleagues to invite them to speak. Aaron and Claudia, are you there?
We are now, yes.
Great. So I wondered if I could please pass over first to you, Claudia, and then afterwards Aaron, to talk about the significance of the people that you invited to speak with, and then I'll introduce in a bit more detail Joe's and mine after that.
Yeah, thanks, Tullis. I invited Jan Hendrikse, and I guess I invited him because he's a good friend that for many, many years, and we've collaborated together quite a few times. And we tend to have conversations about music, sound art, which always end in philosophical discussions. So I thought that he'd be a really good conversation partner.
Thanks. And maybe Aaron, you could come in there as well, please.
Yeah, thank you, Tullis. So I was really honored to be able to speak to Juliet Fraser, who's a London-based
I'd like to say this is part of the piece, and this is all an extended performance.
Can you hear okay, Tullis?
Yeah, we can hear you now. We lost you. So would you mind beginning again, please, Aaron?
I was really happy to be able to talk to Juliet Fraser, who's a UK-based soprano, and I thought of Juliet for a few reasons. One is that she has been engaged in a commissioning her personal practice. She has made a commitment to trying to reduce her carbon footprint as a traveling touring musician. And the third is I love the sound of her voice. And as a soprano actually, for me, part of what was really fascinating about this project is the idea that activism is a kind of a performance, and speaking about climate change is a kind of a performance. And so I hope that you enjoyed Juliet's and the other conversation partners' performances in the piece that you heard on Monday.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Aaron. I'll just fill in for Joe Browning, who invited Catherine Clover. Catherine Clover is a really fascinating UK-based sound practitioner who is working particularly at the moment in relations between human and more than human connection and dialogue. And Joe has been writing about her work, including a piece, a sort of a sound walk performance piece where humans are invited to listen to and then try and imitate and mimic various different birds that they encounter on this sound walk, and look for ways in which that might become a dialogue rather than a human-centered performance. And so Joe's written about this, including in an article in Organised Sound, which you can find if you have access to that. Meanwhile, I spoke to Ruby Colley, who is an interesting composer and performer, violinist, who's working with field recordings and live electronics, and she is the field recordings are guided by a sense of environmental activism, and so that's a departure point for her performance work. So, Aaron, your connection was slightly sketchy, but we'll go back to you first and see if this works okay. I wondered if you could maybe give us a sense of your conversation with Juliet, what came out for you in particular, and how difficult or easy it was to start to contend with these tricky questions that we'd posed.
Thanks, Tullis. Can you hear me a little bit better now?
Yeah.
Great. Well, the conversation was a real pleasure because Juliet is really a charming conversation partner and has a lot to say and a lot to share. But I think this idea of the onus of the individual really came through because some discussions that I've sort of seen broadcast on Facebook or seen take place in a wider context really took on especially a particularly intimate conversation where we were attending to the sound around us and recording the results. And I think that in a way it that personal side to activism, the personal dimension of the experience of what it means to try to take action really came through. And I think that it's so beautifully summarized in the very last quotation that Juliet says in the electronic part of the piece, where she then relates her work to the scientist and one of the very first climate activists, Rachel Carson, and the sort of passion behind her scientific research, and that personal dimension. It's not just people in white coats, it's feeling human beings who care about what they're doing and the world around them, that I think that this project really captured beautifully, or gave us the challenge to try to capture.
Thanks, Aaron. And just to fill in a couple of glitchy gaps in the Zoom link, if that didn't come across before, one of the reasons, or two of the reasons that Aaron had chosen to speak with Juliet was one, that she is, as a performer, pursuing a line of not flying to perform wherever possible. And so quite often she, as a regular performer across the contemporary music scene in Europe, is taking these train journeys from Bratislava to the other side of Portugal or something. She's making these huge journeys, which then become a part of the performance, if you like, of trying to reduce her carbon footprint in that way. And also talks about the detail of how to negotiate that additional cost with festivals. And the second is that she's been working recently in a series of commissioned works for her to sing with composers, and asking them to respond to the work of Rachel Carson, which we heard quoted in the piece. Claudia, maybe you might be able to reflect a little on your conversation with Jan and some of the messages that came out of that between the two of you.
Yeah. So Jan has made a lot of what is conventionally called socially engaged art. And I've recently made a project which brought 28 different arts organizations together all around the world in a project called the World Weather Network. And so we were kind of reflecting on this idea of artist responsibility and kind of the problem with that. Because, well, for one, it's interesting that artists are beholden to sort of think about their impact on the environment in regards to flying, for example. Yet in the media, you don't hear about bankers reflecting on their personal responsibility of flying. So it seems that art, this idea that art can solve massive problems that really no individual can solve, only big conglomerates can solve, is one that we sort of were talking about, of how problematic that is. And also that, okay, it's lovely to take train journeys to get somewhere. That's wonderful if you can do that. But that costs a lot of time and it costs a lot of money. And that then means that it precludes certain artists from having a career who don't have the money or don't have the time. And then we reflected on the fact that it seems like an easy I mean, this is not a new thing, right? You know, artists at the forefront of climate crisis. You know, here in the UK, the idea in the 70s and 80s was, let's satellite artists into a poor, impoverished community. They make an artwork, everything's sorted out. But of course, it doesn't change infrastructure. It doesn't change access to schools, to food, all of those kind of things. And we were sort of thinking that it seems sometimes to be a political device to say, let's get artists to sort that. It looks good, but does it really solve problems? And then we are kind of, as artists, trapped in this, that we're supposed to sort of perform activism, knowing full well that our involvement might be able to reflect on what's going on, might allow people to express how they feel about this situation, but whether it can actually change anything only if some CEO of some big petrochemical organization walks into an installation we've made, and that changes their mind about how they're operating and making money, right? Maybe that can change things, but otherwise, it's problematic. Are we only speaking to the converted? So those are the things that we kind of like were discussing about what a difficult position it puts artists in. Not only artists, also just ordinary people who are told, if you don't recycle, the world is going to go up in flames. Yet, really, whether they recycle or not is not going to really make a difference. So those were the things that we sort of were discussing.
Thanks, Claudia. Yeah, there's a huge amount to pick up on there, and I'll try to return to some of those themes a little bit later in the talk. And it's actually one of the themes of, or one of the outcomes of this work so far is to try and synthesize these very complex and nuanced points is an impossible task, and the difficulty of trying to find ways to say succinctly things that need to be said in larger spaces was a problem for the piece. Joseph Browning, so I should say that Aaron and Juliet and Claudia and Jan met online, and those encounters were recorded over Zoom. Joseph Browning and Catherine Clover met in a mutually agreeable point in Kew Gardens in the west of London, which was sort of in between both where they both live. It's also interesting because it's an institutionalized large botanic garden, but it sits under the Heathrow flight path, and it's also in one of the most affluent areas of West London. So it has quite a lot of the issues which come out in the piece sort of present and cited at that location. Joe and Catherine spent quite a lot of time discussing the aeroplanes passing overhead, or trying to work out how they could have a discussion whilst aeroplanes were going overhead, as well as talking about creating museums for species of plant and living organisms. And that related to Joe's memory of the Joni Mitchell line, take all the trees and put them in a tree museum, which turned up in the piece. My conversation with Ruby Colley was similarly cited outdoors in Hastings, the town in which we both live, which was the background to my first slide. Hastings is a small town which has a number of issues, not least sea level rise and erosion, cliff erosion. And so some of her field recording work and some of our conversation related to ways in which one might listen to, record, and present that kind of change in the climate and the environment. So I just wanted to move a little bit to talk about the composition of this work that we heard, or some of you might have heard on Monday night. One of the challenges, I guess, was then how to take 4 individual or distinct hour-long conversations between 2 people and try and make something of that that was remotely cohesive or coherent, and yet managed to represent distinct views and nuanced points, as I was saying. So this, if nothing else, just illustrates the task that I'd given myself by editing down 4+ hours worth of conversation into something more habitable. The color coding system there, the red parts are the ones that ended up in the final piece, and you can see the loop point, the orange bar at the top is the 15-minute mark. So that was what I was working to in terms of the time allotted for the piece. So that, if nothing else, then demonstrates that the orange stuff was also, I thought, very important, and the blue stuff was important enough to be saved within the session. So there's a lot that is on the cutting room floor. There's a lot that was edited out of the piece. All of these individual blocks, I hope, are succinct enough to make a point outside of the context of the conversation, which was another challenge. How to represent somebody fairly and equitably when the conversation had perhaps taken 40 minutes and led us to a point. If I take that point out and represent it in sampled form, is it still fair to those speakers to present that in that way? Does it still carry the weight that it would have done in the wider conversation? So this was the first compositional layer then, the conversations. My intention was to create some connections between the conversations, so some points of reference or some points of difference, but spoke to each other in dialogue across the room. And also to structure a way of presenting this overload and overwhelming sense of information that is a personal position that I have, one which guided the initial parts of the piece. And that was the opening of the piece then, this sort of saturation of a variety of ideas, quite often happening one over the top of each other, whilst the second half of the piece became space and time to listen to those speakers individually. This was also spatialized, so we had each pair of speakers were placed within the 8-channel surround, so that they stayed static and become a recognizable position, at least, within the room. I just thought I would briefly mention the other layers of the conversation. So the second layer was the live electronics. In case you're interested, these are 3 small, fairly simple bits of hardware. A monophonic synthesizer, an O-Coast made by Make Noise, a microcosm, which is a small kind of granular processor, and a Otto BIM, which is a small reverb unit. These are really just personal decisions on behalf of me as an improviser. They're not fundamental to the piece, they're just fundamental to my practice as an electronic improviser. I quite like simple things that do one thing. And so that those electronics created the pitched material that you heard within the piece. And that pitch material was intended to try and provide a contour, to try and follow the structured, fixed conversation layer, and to try and guide the listener through that in some way, to tune in perhaps to the theme. And the pitches are drawn from particularly the two conversations that have field recordings. Occasionally pitch material turned up into those recordings, and so those I took as departure points for the pitches to be used in the improvised electronics. Finally, there's a third layer, which is amplified voice. Again, in this iteration of the performance, it was my voice, and I was speaking in Spanish, or attempting to. This was to reiterate words or fragments or phrases, ways of trying to present the idea of processing some of these conversations, these ideas, these difficult responses, and also to present the individual within this saturated environment of opinions around how to move forward within the climate crisis. The three compositional layers allow this work to be a modular work, a work as process. It's mutable in form. So the next iteration of this piece could have a different arrangement of those clips that I showed. Those might be arranged with programming more algorithmically or more chance-based. The live electronics are obviously improvised, so those would change. It doesn't necessarily have to be me as a performer. We could invite another performer to respond to that space. The voice, again, could be a different performer, a different language, depending on the country of presentation or the context. And we also plan to make the larger conversations available as in their own right. Again, that's another sort of modular or another iteration of this work. So I wanted to hand back maybe to Aaron and Claudia after I've tried to summarize a bit. You know, what do we learn from this? What have I learned from this process so far? Mainly that it's difficult. These are difficult questions to answer. It's difficult to agree that these are the right questions to ask, and quite a lot of the first 15 minutes of all of these conversations, we're actually interrogating the questions. You know, should we say climate crisis rather than environmental crisis? Is climate not just one part of the wider environment? Does the first question, how do you think creative sound practice can attend, indicate that it does or should? Should we even be having that conversation? Is it the onus on the sound artist, as Claudia articulated? Is there an onus on the individual, or how is that relating to the sound artist practice? And again, the difficulty, as I've tried to explain, of representing a number of voices in a short piece, meanwhile avoiding this preoccupation that all of the artists had, which was that art should provide the answer, or that artists should have the answers. That's problematic in itself. Aaron, Claudia, did you want to respond to any of that in relation to your experiences of the conversations, or having perhaps heard the recording of the piece from Monday night?
Aaron, shall I go first? Okay. Yeah. I think the main thing that sort of strikes me is that, of course, we're going to ask ourselves these questions as artists, right? Because we respond to what happens around us. And it's always been like that. I mean, you look at any artist from any time, and you see that they were responding to the problems in their time, and you can't really get away from climate crisis or an environmental crisis or environmental extinction, like others want to call it, probably rightly so. And it's one of the biggest questions of our time that is completely global. So everybody is affected by that. So of course, we as artists are going to respond to that. But it is very tricky to respond to something that is so enormous, that has so many different manifestations, because what happens due to the climate crisis in one area might be that there's too much water, and the other area there's not enough water. So, when you're making a work about something that affects you, it might not really translate to someone else somewhere else. I mean, I guess that's always the case with art. But I think it's, we've talked, all of us have probably talked about the idea of Timothy Morton's hyperobject. We're kind of all involved in this big question, and how do we tackle it? I guess there is no answer. Otherwise, we would have solved everything. But I think asking questions in itself is a really important thing to do. Even if you can't find the answer, it might show you a way to at least cope, or us to cope with the situation that we find ourselves in. And that in itself is important, even if we don't find a solution or a final answer. Over to you, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks, Claudia. I think for me, both in my personal part of the piece, but also I think in the finished result, where this project really succeeded was in the personal stories and the sort of fine grain of the details of talking to somebody about her decisions, her choices, her joys and difficulties in pursuing those, and things that maybe on Facebook or in the newspaper could sound kind of preachy or moralizing, or become something that actually are much more kind of rich and loving and caring. But there was an interesting moment at the end of our conversation where we sort of said, well, and what about everything else? What about the decisions that festival presenters are going to have to make about all the other musicians, and other artists are going to have to make about their practices? And we sort of realized that that was just a whole cliff that we weren't going to be able to go over in this conversation. And I think that that's okay, but of course it's that's in a way that this challenge we face, the power of the individual in some ways, and then the sometimes frustration against the much bigger scale of these issues.
Yeah, indeed. And so I think that without wishing to present this as anything more than my position, I feel that that's the point then here in this piece, is that these issues make it all the more important to inhabit that topic and inhabit it through art making, through sound practice, to create some kind of environment in the concert hall that allows individual reflection and allows the listener to become a part of that conversation, a part of that dialogue. Thank you, Aaron and Claudia, for being with us. Thank you all very much for listening.
Gracias. Do you have any questions? ¿O preguntas? Ok. Entonces, muchísimas gracias.